Good evening and welcome to TDM Talk Show. I'm your host, Joana Freitas. With us this evening we have Rostam Neuwirth, Head for Department of Global Legal Studies of the University of Macau, also a specialist on trade law and intellectual property. Good evening, Professor. Thank you so much for being here with us on the show. I would start with one of your areas of expertise. There are many. Intellectual property is one of them. Intellectual property is something that we do talk about, maybe not as much as we should. Why is intellectual property something important?
Well, it has, in my view, increased in importance over the years, over the last century in particular. The first international agreements for protecting intellectual property, they were adopted at the end of 1883, 1886. And then, of course, the 20th century, during that time, the current international legal system was created. And more recently, in 1995, it became even more important with the recognition by the TRIPS agreement, which is an agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And that brought, in particular, together the fields of intellectual property rights with international trade law. And it brought it also under the aegis of the World Trade Organization, which of course increased the importance of it. But the reason is also that technologies have clearly, and innovation and scientific progress and technological progress have transformed the economy, and we are moving gradually and now even more quickly from a goods-based to a service-based and what is now called the creative economy, an experience economy, where consumption is more intangible than tangible. We are less consuming intangible goods, actually, and more services and experiences. And that is one of the reasons why the importance of intellectual property rights has increased, and that was recognized also in international law.
Mm-hmm. But the fact that there's exactly the technology is more developed as actually bring more challenges to also protect that intellectual property?
Of course, yes. I mean, this is the problem with technological progress. It is always it is generally neutral, and it depends a bit what you use the technology for, because there are always advantages, but there come disadvantages. Like a car helps us to get faster from A to B, but there's pollution maybe, and so on and so forth. And of course, these technologies in particular have enhanced the possibilities to produce and in particular to disseminate across borders much faster cultural content, for example. And that has, of course, increased the market, but it also has facilitated the way to copy content from one content carrier to another and transform it quickly and send it across borders. And so, yes, everything brings advantages, and then there are disadvantages connected to that.
When we were talking just before, you were mentioning the differences between the property of something that is tangible and the property of something that is not tangible, like the intellectual property. As a lawyer also, and someone that works with the law, can you tell us a little bit of what are these hardships, these difficulties that people have when they deal with intellectual property and tangible property?
Yeah, I mean, that the concept itself is a contradiction in a way, because we used the concept of property, which was for tangible objects like a house or a car or something, and then we use it now to protect the intellectual, the fruits of mental labor as opposed to physical labor. And this is a kind of tension, of course, because it is not possible to get hold of an idea, and I mean, you can fix it by writing it down and by filming it and recording it, but on the other hand, these technologies have increased again the possibilities to transfer it from one medium to another, and again these two constantly clash, as we see. Like, for example, a book in the past was like a printed book, a good, and now you can also transform it into an e-book, and then you can send it across borders as an electronic signal. And the same with movies. Movies used to be on a film reel, and now you can just download, stream movies through the internet. And the real problem here is the contradiction, on the one hand, between intangible and tangible, but also between borders and borderless markets. And this is, I think, the problem with cyberspace, because cyberspace is a kind of a space without borders. So is it a space then? It's a spaceless space, if you want. And that creates, of course, from a legal perspective, huge problems, because especially trade law and intellectual property law is still very territorial. I mean, the law applies within the territory of the state or the legal system that we are talking about. And that is in conflict. The same is true also for e-commerce, of course, because this e-commerce is also a global market potentially, but you have to, on the other hand, for the tangible goods to be shipped, it is still passing through virtual borders or real borders, yes.
How can we overcome that if we're talking, especially if we focus in, for example, Macau now, not only we have that of the borderless space, the cyberspace, but we also have a really small region that is just a neighbor with mainland China and Hong Kong. So there are borders where they're so small and they're so almost together. How can we overcome and actually protect the intellectual property of someone?
Yeah, that's exactly one of my main interests. How to deal with contradictions, and these have also been named as the kind of the concepts that characterize our time. That there's a scholar, James Rosenau, who in 1995 said the 21st century governance in the 21st century will be we will have to deal with profound contradictions and perplexing paradoxes, I think he said. And this is exactly what we are seeing now. And Macau is, from a legal perspective, a really fascinating place to study the law in particular, like you said, because it is a local player, very small, on the one hand, part of the People's Republic of China, but on the other hand, it's a global player. It's a member of the World Trade Organization, like with the same legal standing as the big players in the WTO. So contradictions do not mean, in my view, that they cannot be reconciled. To the contrary, I think they're like, in a way, trying to inspire us or trying to tell us that we have to find the ways to do so. And of course, I think we have to rethink the territoriality principle in international law at one point, because we are creating so many problems or facing them, like global climate change, which do not stop at borders. So we need to update the way of reasoning, legal reasoning, and generally, I think, find new logics also to deal with problems of apparent contradictions and look for ways to reconcile them. And of course, one way is also to try to reform the international legal order as we have created it basically in 1945 with the United Nations and the WTO in 1995, which is already to a large extent obsolete because it was created in a pre-internet age. So there is need to constantly update and for the law to follow the developments that are set in real life, yes.
I would actually like to talk about that a little bit later. For now, I would like just to focus a little bit more on Macau. Do you think that the legal framework that we have, the laws that we have to protect intellectual property in Macau, we also have some agreements with mainland China mostly. Do you think that, how do you analyze that law in Macau? Do you think it's effective? Do you think it's actually put in place?
Yeah, I mean, just a few days ago, I read the most recent WTO trade policy review report. It's the 5th on Macau. The WTO regularly visits its members and then looks at the different trade policies, other policies, to assess to what extent the WTO member is complying with its obligations under the various WTO agreements, and one of them being the TRIPS, to which Macau is a member. And I mean, the report really reads like a model student in many ways, and I think clearly from a legal perspective, Macau has done what is necessary, clearly, and even beyond in many ways. And it also, more importantly for intellectual property rights, I think it takes efforts not only in the legal sphere, but also like in terms of educational policies, like education or raising awareness and informing also like potential creators in Macau about the benefits of it and what are the consequences of not complying with it. So in an international comparison, I think Macau is doing pretty well, clearly, and that was also clearly reflected by the WTO recent report, yes.
One of the main industries we're trying to develop here in Macau for many years now, it's the creative industries, and in my view these are connected to this intellectual property and also just the goods property. Do you think that the local creative industries have challenges to deal by having a balance between the commerce of goods and the property rights? Or do you think that locally that is not a problem that we have to be concerned with?
Yeah, that is difficult to tell, like in particular to what extent, as I said, the law alone, the legal framework alone will not be able to create a strong creative industry. You need to have a lot of conditions in place. I think you need, of course, a legal framework which at the moment ensures that a creator is rewarded for the hard work that he puts into the creation of the work, which is the original idea of intellectual property rights, that you reward an individual in order to give the benefit to the society as a whole. But this balance is very often no longer, I think, in place, especially also due to new technologies and so on, where it is possible that very often the creator receives least of the money. And this is an interesting this is more a business model, like it is known from cinema as the star system, for example, that you pay an exorbitant amount of money and then the rest is underpaid, which creates, of course, the appeal for everyone, because everybody wants to be the successful Hollywood actor or the Cristiano Ronaldo in soccer, but the rest is not receiving a $400 million deal. And this is this is an area which is not captured by intellectual property rights per se, and there are other fiscal measures, fiscal laws, for example, or maybe competition rules or trade rules that need to be supportive of the creation of such cultural content. And then, of course, you need also education, because you need to give the potential and the future creators the soil on which they can plant their creative ideas.
And they actually want to continue doing it because they are being treated fair. Exactly,
yes. So there are a lot of factors that have to come together. But Macau, in my view, is in a good position due to its size in particular and the unique legal framework as a local and a global player at the same time. Plus, I think the gaming industry is also providing a very good starting point for developing from the gaming sector what is the attempt, in fact, to diversify the economy and so on. I think but from the history of the cultural industries, they are very dynamic and they tend to move from a center of cultural industry, cultural heritage even, to a periphery. And here, I think, if this is used properly, it can create very good outcomes.
Do you think the consumer has a role in this balance of creator and property rights and development of the market?
Of course. I mean, these technologies have also changed drastically even the notion of a consumer and a producer. For example, various social media like Facebook, they have coined actually a new kind of contradiction in terms, like a new oxymoron, which is the prosumer. Because when you have an account, you produce content by uploading images and you consume, but you are neither paid and nor do you pay.
It's almost a trade by trade.
Yes, but someone else reaps the benefit. The platform provider, yes, and through advertising, of course. So in a way, you are also the product, because you're also you think it's for free, but you are becoming the product, because meanwhile, you're influenced from the advertisement, which then maybe leads you to buy stuff that you would otherwise not have known about. So that changes the relationship between producer-consumer. There's a third party, and that is also something where intellectual property rights don't fit in much, because we have to see, and that is the debate also about taxation of these internet giants and so on. And there are many related questions. The real challenge from a legal perspective is, I think, to achieve a strong policy coherence where you're not neutralizing an effort in one area by a counter effort in another area. But that is again a conceptual problem, I think.
And something hard to do for sure. When if you start putting taxes on these platforms, people are going to be charged. So the prosumer kind of ceases to exist almost. The intellectual property theft was one of the main reasons that the United States pointed for this ongoing China-United States trade war. When China joined the WTO in 2001, they agreed to reform some parts of their economy, but the European Union still says today that China still has some problems to overcome, one of them exactly being the intellectual property. Do the defense and the protection of that intellectual property, do you agree with this? Do you agree that China is still still has to overcome this, what's being accused of by so many partners in the European Union and the United States also?
Sure. That depends strongly on what perspective you take. I mean, clearly, every WTO member can do more in terms of protecting and enforcing intellectual property rights. And we had cases against European countries, we had cases against the United States, which also the US lost, and then against China, which China lost. Most of the time in the WTO, actually, I think members lose when you get sued, because everybody has the tendency to come from a protectionist way of thinking. And so, of course, that's part of the role of the WTO, to liberalize international trade. So everybody has to, it's the same I've experienced in the European Union when my country, Austria, joined. There are a lot of existing laws that are simply not compatible with a wider regional way of organizing an internal market. So that's, of course, one thing. The second thing is that every country has deficiencies here, and a professor from the United States in intellectual property rights law told me once, if the US would scrutinize itself, it would also be on the list of sanctions for not complying with it. And that's a kind of a paradox, that we always like looking at others, of course, and not
it's always easier to point a finger to others.
Exactly. The other thing is, clearly, do we agree with everything that this system, the system that is in place? And here, China has joined the WTO at the moment when everything was settled. Everything was negotiated during the Uruguay round 8 years before 1994. So China could only, at the time, receive it and had to comply with it. Now the question, of course, is that you do maybe not agree with all the elements, and I don't agree with all the aspects of intellectual property rights as they are right now. For example, there's the whole field of intangible cultural heritage, which is also important and which does not fit into this thinking of, which is very important for traditional knowledge and many indigenous peoples, and they're not included in this flow of financial revenues or royalties. So clearly, we have to work at the same time. Of course, we should try to comply and respect the law as it is, but we also have to think about how the law should be in the future. Because
you were exactly mentioning that earlier. You were saying that there need to be a new, like a revision, a full-on revision of the way the WTO is processing, is working. What do you mean by that? What exactly is needed? What do we need to change? I know that you're working on something also about that. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, I had the pleasure this year to co-edit a book on a scenario of both a utopian and dystopian scenario of a post-WTO international legal order. So because in fact, since last year, the most important function, in my view, of the WTO, the appellate body, the dispute settlement function, is paralyzed due to the fact that the US had opposed the reappointment of new judges for the appellate body, and so without judges you can't decide, and the whole system is now you appeal in the void, and it is kind of paralyzed. Yes, so clearly that has put the whole WTO in question, and a simple, I think it is very difficult to start even where it, but in the end what has to be achieved is, as I said, a coherent balance between a lot of trade issues and so-called non-trade issues like trade and health, trade and the environment, trade and culture. And it is not so important maybe to look for detailed questions like, of course, you could say that the WTO is outdated by separating goods from services, which is very difficult because when is a book a good and when is it a service as an e-book that you download and so on. But the overall question is really, it's a bit of a, I think a fundamental philosophical question. What do we want to achieve by trading among each other? Because I could say, is trade an end in itself? Is it enough that we trade, or is trade a means to an end? And I would say, like, when we look at the current situation with the pandemic, of course, pharmaceutical products, medicines are not available in every place, or the ingredients for them even. So we should use trade as a means to end the pandemic, for example. But these are fundamental questions about what is the purpose of doing trade, and what is the economy, and what goals should it serve. And we are in a bit in a luxurious position now as the world, as humanity, I think, where we have created so many possibilities through new technologies, which are incredible, that were unheard of before. But now we have them, and we don't know what to do with them in a way, or what to address.
They came too easy and then complicate a little bit also our lives.
Yes, indeed.
The trade, you gave so many examples of how trade can be used, and there's one function that it has, I think, that it's the most, I think most of people at least know this one because it's on the news daily, which is trade being used as a weapon. I recall the recent European Union restrictions on exports to Hong Kong because of the national security law, and also, as we mentioned before, the trade war between China and the United States. Is trade also being used as a weapon?
Yeah, of course. I try not to use the notion of a trade war. I think this is a trade conflict, and at least even with all the flaws in the system, the multilateral system, so far it has worked pretty well. When we look at like the China-US trade conflict, and when we look at, for example, Brexit as well, I mean, which is also a major like change for the European continent. Yeah, it is actually, and here at least it has all played out in various forms of legal disputes and not in military terms, which is, I think, I understand a war. I don't like to use the term war on other like ways of other conflicts simply like. So in that sense, yes, it is obvious that even in the United Nations Charter, it is foreseen that, like, when you have a political disagreement and you want to force maybe some other party into behaving in a different way, ideally you use first sanctions, economic sanctions, rather than military force. The only problem is here that on the one hand, the system between the United Nations and the WTO is, for historical reasons, was separated in a way. And we see this with the national security exception, which is invoked now a lot, that a member, basically to protect its own national security, can violate any trade obligation, which is undermining the system then.
It's being overused?
Yeah, no, it was never touched. It was a taboo for a long time, but now it has been invoked several times, and it is, unfortunately, there's a danger to be overused, and that would undermine the system. So we also have to think in the long term, or in the short term already, how to make sure that it does not escalate, and that, in fact, trade disputes are settled before they can escalate into a trade war, which then leads maybe to, very often, as we know from the past, which is why the WTO, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was created in 1947, to avoid that protectionist policies lead to, the devastating consequences that World War I, II had brought.
Do you think that the trade agreements, we have trade agreements within the European Union and European Union with others, and then we have the BRICS also, and we have the most recent one actually just last month, I think it was signed between the 15 Asia Pacific countries. Are these agreements kind of consequences of that trade being used as a weapon of like changes in power or developments in politics? Do you think they of course they're not just from one day to the other, they're not showing up just like that. They're being negotiated. But do you think that they're just arriving to an agreement point because of that trade being used as a weapon?
Yeah, of course. It's another problem, conceptual problem of between multilateralism and regionalism, and very often, again, like intellect or property, we may look at it, or the glass, as half empty, half full, or is it complementary, or is it mutually exclusive? And with regard to regional agreements or bilateral agreements, they are usually also very often the starting point for multilateralism. So, because when everybody has already agreements with everyone else, we could say, why not make it easier for everyone, and we all sit down and agree on a common standard, which we already have de facto from bilateral agreements. And that was the idea behind the GATT, in particular historically, that with most favored nation treatment, which means that whenever I give one party a favorable treatment, it automatically extends to everyone else in the club, in the group, and that is just a way to facilitate communication, because otherwise you have to talk to 164 member states, which is not as easy anymore as it was with 23 in the beginning. And here it was foreseen that regional agreements can always exist because they have a kind of positive impact also on multilateralism, because it is for China now, the European Union is definitely easier to talk to, because you talk to one kind of voice instead of 27 now, so which has a positive impact on multilateral trade. And the same with Asian, the TPP or the RCEP and other regional agreements. Of course, they also have a danger that they can divert trade to these regions only, and then we have kind of an isolation again. But I think here we must see that the current trend is a bit more towards regionalism, because multilateralism has suffered a setback. But it was always in the history that, I think progress is never kind of linear. There's always 2 steps forward, 3 steps backward. But it is, in my view, unthinkable to give up also. But maybe I'm biased as someone who heads a global studies department. But it is unthinkable that a multilateral and a global platform will be abandon the idea for the future, because we have too many global phenomena in terms of trade and in terms of challenges.
Locally.
We cannot deal with them, even regionally.
The most recent one, the RCEP, it was signed between 15 countries. They're all Asia Pacific, and this is, as far as I know, as far as I've read, the largest bloc in trade. It takes a lot of like 3/3 of the population of the world. So some people, especially United States, are excluded of this agreement, and some people are saying this is just a way of China to mark their position. And you were saying that we cannot completely ignore that we live in a global era, but we are actually talking about a regional agreement that was on the table for 8 years and now was signed during a pandemic. Is this actually a motive for us to be dubious about this agreement, or do you think it showed up because of another reason, that is, it has not to do with this fear that some have?
I mean, there are too many even to follow all of these regional agreements, and everyone seems to be a bit in a race of I have signed with this one, I've signed with that one, and the EU and the US. The US pulled out of many, like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they pulled out, and then to everyone's surprise, and it is very difficult to see always what is the reason here behind. I tend to take a broader look at it, and it just shows, in a way, this is also an encouraging sign that we, even during the time of the pandemic, we are seeing progress, at least regionally, because it will also, in a way, if used properly, facilitate maybe progress at the multilateral level at one point. And of course, the problem is always in this like international relations, or in the political aspects of it, that maybe there are other like kind of motives behind. I look at it from a legal perspective and from the perspective of continuity and stability. And here, clearly, I mean, to now try to single out that China is doing this, or the United States is doing that for this reason, and so on, is short-term thinking, because both would lose a huge market, which they have hugely benefited from in the past. So I mean, this is, if you're ready to pay that price, that's why I think regionalism is a short-term trend now, a stronger regionalism. It will maybe lead to more what is called mega regional agreements, of course, like the EU is already mega in terms of the number from where they started and where they are now. But it needs a multilateral framework as well, because there is always there are many issues and reasons for why there will be incentives to trade also with, especially between like the United States, the EU, China.
The biggest ones, the biggest players in the... Yeah. Going back to the EU, Brexit is on the horizon. We don't know if it will be postponed or not, or how is it going to happen. But if... the UK will not be bound by the European Union's rules when it comes to trade. What do you think are the consequences to this, if there are any?
Yeah, I mean, Brexit has already happened. The question is now, what will be the future of the framework between the UK and the EU? I mean, they must settle this in the next few days, basically. Yes. Otherwise, it will be a no, again, a no deal. I'm already fed up with all the
last
past
notice.
Years. Yeah, it's always like, will there be a no deal? And I'm already confused. Have they left or not? And then it's already, you hear a lot like that. There's this race that Britain will now negotiate all the trade agreements it was already part of as a member of the EU. So it's a complete like yes, but. Here again, even with Brexit, I mean, I felt sad about it from the beginning, because I think it is a kind of a violation of the original spirit of the treaties. And you're also taking decisions on the future, for future generations who could not vote on that issue. And so it was, I think, from that perspective, against the spirit of the founding treaties. But okay, it happened. And now it is also like, it is always the problem when you take a decision and then instead of pursuing the decision with coherent policies, you start regretting it, or you're not, you're always divided over it, and you keep like fighting what to do instead of doing something which benefits everyone. And it is here, it is also clear the UK cannot deny its geographic location, which is very close to the other European Union members, and vice versa. The United Kingdom is also like, has always been an important trading partner and also source of inspiration for Europe and so on. So again, here it is a matter of finding solutions and that are sustainable and make sense, and both sides, of course, can benefit from, because otherwise it's everyone's loss. And that's why I regret, even from that perspective, that it happened. And then I think they will definitely have to bear the consequences of the cost of renegotiating all to get access for British products to markets somewhere else, and even the European market now. Yeah. That's the question, because they will fall back into they have to find a completely new customs classification.
And they're closer neighbors.
Yes.
We are almost at the end of our show, but I would not let you go without asking you something that is very curious to me. One of your areas of teaching is global justice and creative economy. Global justice. What is global justice, and why does it matter?
Yeah, that's a very timely question, because just this morning I finished teaching this course. It was the last course for this semester, and it is one of the general education courses at the University of Macau, which is like for undergraduate students from different backgrounds, different majors, and that's challenging for the professor, because how do you explain global justice to an economist, to a political scientist, to a psychology student, or to a computer scientist?
They all have their own visions.
Exactly. And I must say, I have brought these terms together because of my interest in this literary term of an oxymoron, because both are kind of contradictory, because the creativity, the cultural background was separated from the economic one. So creative economy is a converged concept between culture and trade. And global justice is still very much a fiction or a contradiction, because simply that the global legal system doesn't exist, or it is largely fragmented. So with that, I approached the course, and it was surprising, because I started this course, I think now 5 years ago. And it was really, in the beginning, very difficult to explain what is an oxymoron, what is a paradox, and how do these two vast concepts relate even to each other.
They're contradictory. There's
themselves.
Itself.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. But to my surprise, it is unfortunately not possible in a few minutes. But every year, I have now tested it with many patient students, actually. After 3-4 weeks, the response was very good and very encouraging. And actually, if they had responded in a more like negative way, I would have never even published a book about it, because. But they were really the ones who encouraged me the most, because they came every year. I asked them to give examples of oxymoron around their life, and they find them. And Macau is rich of contradictions in that sense, but also has a long tradition of reconciling them. So there's a lot of understanding, and it was very encouraging. So, and I think what it does is it helps us to understand, to bridge the gap between the more political organization of the international legal system, like under the UN, and the more economic under the WTO, on the one hand, and to deal also with the cognitive challenges that come from all these concepts around us, which are so contradictory, which is also a trend of technological convergence, where we have new products like nutraceutics, for example, which is food and pharmaceuticals being combined, which then don't fit in either category. So they are a good example of enhancing or trying to look for cognitive solutions to such contradictions, and students have received it well, and I hope it will benefit them in the future in solving problems, and maybe also finding creative solutions or becoming a creator in some areas.
A global justice fighter.
Yes.
You had one book. You have one book on this theme. You also have some other works. Can we expect something else in the future, in the short term or long?
Yeah, I mean, we have to publish a lot on a constant basis, and I work on several articles right now, more on as I said, I think, on actually in my book on the law in the time of oxymoron, which was published in 2018. I wrote the preface in 2017, and I said I compared back then the situation in law like a pandemic, a global pandemic, that as a disease that has befallen the area of law, because the title of the book is Law in the Time of Oxymoron, which I coined after Gabriel Garcia Marquez's book, Love in the Time of Cholera. So that love can flourish in the time of a disease, and I hope law as well. So I think now the major challenge for humanity and for the international community is to realize the cognitive changes that this pandemic, as a global event that we are all really exposed to at the same time and the same place, will have, and that hopefully this will lead to a different understanding of the role of law in the future. And that will be probably my next major book, if I have time to write one. But articles will some.
We look forward to talk to you about it, and thank you so much. This is all the time we got for tonight. Thank you so much for being with us here on the show. Thank you. This is all for this evening. TDM Talk Show will be back soon. The team here at the show wishes you a very, very Merry Christmas. Good night.